Welcome to Review the Future, the podcast that takes an in-depth look at the impact of technology on culture.
I'm John Perry.
I'm Ted Cupper.
And today on Review the Future, we're asking the question, what happens in a world of perfectly fakeable audio and video? So this is something that appears to be on the horizon. It's getting easier and cheaper to create fake video footage, fake audio footage, and the potential exists for a world where it's incredibly cheap for pretty much anyone to fake anything that they would want to fake and make somebody say something they didn't say or make some events appear to have happened that didn't actually happen. And so today we wanted to talk about, if that's a future we're heading for, what does that look like and what would be the impacts? Now, in some senses, it's always been possible to fake this stuff. In fact, today, if you have an incredibly large CGI budget and paid actors and a lot of money and time, arguably you can make a pretty convincing hoax of anything. So I think that the difference between that state of things and the future state of things that we want to think about is when that becomes really cheap and available to everybody.
Well, not just cheap, but also available in real time, right? Because I think, of course, it's been possible to fake audio and video in high-end films for a long time, as you say, but that's a non-real-time process, right? Artists sit there and paint things frame by frame, or they use high-end computer software for days and days in order to make a single shot. If you're talking about Forrest Gump or whatever iconic film you can think of where reality is faked. But with some of the things that we've seen demos of recently, not only are these commodity software products that can run on your desktop computer, but they run instantly in real time.
Sure. So you could imagine a situation where you get a phone call and it sounds like your friend. It sounds exactly like your friend talking to you in real time. But really it's being generated by software on the fly. So when you ask a question of your supposed friend, in this case, you get a on-the-fly answer that's completely fake. So that's the potential of a real-time technology, right?
Right. As opposed to like a pre-recorded message from the president or something, which we've heard before. Those kinds of things could be faked before, but they quickly give themselves up as fake because you say, hey, wait a minute, and then the recording doesn't stop.
Although I think maybe there's like two sort of points in the horizon then that we could imagine, right? Because I think first we would get to a point where non-real time, but just really good faked stuff would be doable by, say, one person, in a day. So if, in other words,
I think we're actually there. I think that's our current world, right? I mean, if I have Nuke and I know how to use it, then I can fake something pretty well.
Well, so let's talk about, are we discussing audio? Are you talking about audio, for example? Let's start with that.
Sure, let's talk about audio, right. I mean, there's a lot of signal processing that's already available cheaply or free that you can use to fake all manner of audio effects and styles.
Yeah, I think with audio, it's a lot easier. I've heard obviously edits and chopped up things of people saying things they didn't say. I haven't heard one that was totally convincing to me 100%, although...
Sure you have, you just didn't know. Right?
Well, that's very possible.
If you ever watch reality television, then you've heard people say all kinds of things that they didn't say. That stuff is Frankenbit to within an inch of its life, right? There's an industry term in reality for chopping up people word by word or even vowel by vowel and making them say what you want, which is Frankenbiting, right? That's the industry term. And it's used so commonly that it's a skill set that people have.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, I had forgotten about that. Is there an easy place to hear a demo of that online, though? I mean, because obviously, I don't work in the reality TV field. We know many people who do, being in Los Angeles. but I would like to hear like a before and after demonstration of what people can do with that.
I think it's one of those things that for the most part they try to hide it, but I'm not sure whether there's a good example of that, but I've definitely heard it in action. And the kinds of things that they can do now in non-real-time audio editing include changing the pitch of individual syllables and time stretching individual syllables independent of pitch. And so you can do things like make people ask a question when they didn't initially, or, chop up a sentence word by word and literally make them say the opposite of what they said. They can say, I'm here to make friends, and you can make them say, I'm not here to make friends, right? You can do quite a lot, and they do, to just completely subvert the intention of the actor. What I don't think commodity signal processing does terribly well right now. I mean, you can do formant changes and things like that, which will change like the apparent gender or race of the voice, but they don't seem to have the kind of mapping necessary to, for example, transform something that I spoke in my own natural voice into something that, sounds exactly like Barack Obama said it, or something like that. That level of signal processing, while possible, is outside the realm of the sort of democratized tool set that everybody has access to.
Well, also, if I wanted to say write a 20-minute speech, for someone to say, I think that would be a tremendous amount of work for one person to do with today's technology still, right? And I mean, I think probably what I would imagine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is a lot of the editing that happens in reality television is just tweaking of things. You have a lot of source. You can turn a statement into a question. You can remove a word. You can completely change the context. You can splice multiple sentences together. But if I just need someone saying, a sentence that I write, I don't know if you can just generate that convincingly, or is your impression that is possible?
Yeah, you can. It is work intensive, so I think they limit themselves to doing that only when absolutely necessary. But let's say I had, interviewed you about, how you feel about the other contestants on some game show that you're on. I could turn what you said into the Gettysburg Address with the kinds of stuff that we have now. I mean, it might take hours, and it may not be worth it for the company to pay their audio person to do that. But that technology is available at this point.
Okay.
And has been, I think, for a little while in the professional world. And those tools, they start expensive and they trickle down to everybody. But there's, I think, some significant difference between that and some of these demos that we've seen recently, which seem to go far beyond what I'm used to in the audio post world.
Sure. So why don't we stay on audio for a second?
Sure.
Right. So there's a pretty cool tech demo that you can see online that's been making the rounds for a company called Lyrebird.
Right. This is the one I was thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah. Lyre spelled Lyre, although it's pretty funny that it sounds like the other liar.
Yeah. I didn't even catch that when I looked at it.
Yeah, I don't know if that's intentional on their part, but you can certainly make lying statements with this. But it claims to be able to take a 1-minute audio clip of anyone talking and then, deduce from that person's unique speech signature. I forget the term that they use, but sort of like the key for like how that person talks, the form and shapes and so on. And then once they've deduced that sort of person's speech pattern from a minute of audio, then you can do what I was sort of describing might be possible, where you could type in any sentence you want, and without any additional work, it can essentially make that person, or what sounds like that person, say that sentence.
Yeah, what's so cool about Lyrebird is it's a synthesizer, not an editing tool. So you don't need very much source at all. It trains the synthesizer on the minute of source that you give it in order to create a patch that will then, using regular text-to-speech technology, be able to say anything you type more or less believably. And we listen to these, and they have trained them on famous voices such as Obama and Trump and some other famous voices, and they're pretty convincing. I mean, I don't know if they're 100% convincing right now, but they are, I'd say, on the level of like a good human impersonator.
Yeah, I would say they're not. I don't think they're actually convincing at all, in the sense that I wouldn't be inclined to believe they were real, unless you had some excuse for why it was like a very garbled, line that was being tapped or something. Because they do sound a little bit garbled, but they are very recognizable as that person.
Right.
Certainly, yeah, if you wanted to make, say, a funny video or a cartoon of Obama or Trump doing something silly, you could use this in lieu of a good impersonator, and I think like it would play pretty well, actually. So it's about that good. It's like it's good enough to call that person to mind and create those associations strongly. It's not, I don't think it would fool anyone, but it's a tech demo. I mean, it's a really impressive sign of things to come. I mean, you got to assume it's going to improve.
Right. And for me anyway, the way that it fell short was not so much in the impersonation as in the just general roboticness of the text to speech. So it failed in sort of the same way that Siri or Alexa fails to me to be 100% human. It did still sound a bit like a robot.
Yeah. There's some artifacts or something in it that you can hear. It does randomize the intonation. One of the parts of the demos on the website, and we'll link to this, of course, so our audience can check it out, is that it won't say the same thing the same way twice, right? So it has some sort of algorithm that introduces some intonation variation so that it is a lot more human than many speech synthesizers are. Yeah,
and you can imagine over a low quality connection such as a phone, you might actually get tricked a bit by that, because if you were to, say, get a telemarketing call from Robo-Trump, and you're like, hey, are you a robot? Just something I sometimes say when I'm not sure if I'm talking to a robot just yet. It might say, no, I'm not a robot in a believable Trump voice, and you might say, you sure you're not a robot? And it might say, no, I'm not a robot, in a different way, and then that might help to convince you. It seems like that technology is gonna get better too, because the things that are wrong with it are things that have been sort of getting better in general in text to speech over the years, and so I would imagine that they're riding some sort of machine learning curve that they're gonna continue to improve.
So shall we talk about the state of video for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so again, it's possible to fake things to a tremendous degree today with a lot of time, and I think more time and more money than it would take on the audio side.
Certainly more processing power.
Yeah. And we have plenty of examples of big budget movies that do a lot of CGI processing and create very, very believable fake stuff. It's just that that's not really... Again, the amount of resources you have to expend to pull that off would make like a casual hoax not only just probably not worth pulling off, but also the sheer amount of energy you'd have to put into creating a convincing fake, I feel like would also leave a trail, right? Because you'd probably have to hire a bunch of skilled experts.
Well, it is possible, if you know what you're doing, to do this stuff on your own. Like there have been a few really well-known fan films that have come out in the last few years that have basically had, blockbuster quality effects. So Gareth Edwards, the director who went on to direct Rogue One, the most recent Star Wars world movie, he started his career with a film that he did all the effects himself on. And I think it took him, years, but he didn't have money and he had skills. So he spent that time and was able to produce, believably fake effects for a movie. But again, what I think is like really shocking and amazing about where the art's going is this idea of being able to do this stuff very quickly, either literally in real time or with minimal tweaking and rendering, because it used to be that you would have to very carefully plan this stuff and then wait overnight or longer for it to render, and then you can check it out and see if there's problems, make tweaks, rinse and repeat over and over again. It was a very time-consuming, labor-intensive process.
Right. And so, moving more to the potential state of the art with this stuff, back to the world of tech demos here.
Yeah, fun new tech demos, our favorite.
Yeah, there's a fun tech demo that you can see online for something called face-to-face.
That's with the number 2, face to face, like it's a Prince song.
Exactly. And we'll put a link to that as well. But so this is a real-time way to fake facial expressions and speech in particular. So you need 2 video streams, right? You have a source video, which could say be Ted or I just, sitting in a studio talking and saying the things that we want to make Obama say, right? And then we also have...
Right, so that's the thing that you're taking the facial expressions from, essentially.
Right, so that would analyze, a video of me talking, deduce my facial structure, create a model of my face essentially, and track over time the position of the corners of my mouth and like the different facial muscles. And then this technology can then apply that face map to say an existing video of Obama giving an interview.
Right, they have like a target face from like a video stream, or I think it can even be a pretty short loop, and then they're able to map the facial expressions that you're showing onto the face that you have designated as your target.
Right, and so then it looks like Obama is saying whatever it is that I'm trying to make him say.
Yeah, and what's so amazing about this tech demo is that it is real time, so that you can sit there and watch a monitor and watch your Obama puppet, your photoreal, CNN news stream Obama puppet or whatever, literally make the facial expressions and say the words that you're saying. It's like real-time one-to-one puppetry where, your face controls their face. And that's, from a performance point of view, like really, really interesting. Like if you were an actor or impressionist, what an amazing tool for you to do a more engaging performance.
Well, for one thing, this feels like made to be married with the previous technology that we were talking about, where you can also generate these people's voices, right, to go along with the correct facial expressions. But of course, just with the state of the face-to-face technology today and the demos that you can see online, if you just imagine a good impressionist having access to that, I feel like they could make some very, very funny stuff.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. I was just thinking, as you said that, it would be hard to marry those technologies literally, but it seems like you want like a third technology that would transform your voice in real time into an impression of the other person rather than a voice synthesizer like the Lyrebird technology. Right.
Well, then it would be a one-step process rather than a two-step process.
Right.
Like otherwise you'd have to, first like get the video and then get the audio and then cut those together.
I would think you'd have to get the audio and then you'd have to perform your video to the audio in order.
Sure.
I think if you were to use those particular technologies, I think that's the way that would have to work. But I could imagine you could have signal processing that basically has the same technique as the Lyrebird thing, but instead of being a synthesizer, it just takes live input and changes the intonation, changes the formants, maybe even mixes up the speeds and things like that to really make it match. Yeah, you could have like basically a one-click button in the near future maybe that is a, impression button.
Yeah, and speaking of the one-click button, I mean, let's now get to the point we're imagining, right? Which is fast forward however many years you think this takes, and this becomes not a super labor-intensive thing, not something that requires a ton of expertise, but something where literally anyone can just, concoct a fake Donald Trump speech and distribute it on the internet.
Right, with no more difficulty as making a cat-eared Instagram video or something, right? Like
exactly,
it becomes like one of these democratized AR toys that we have now kind of a lot of, where anyone can, hold their phone up to their face and talk into it, and the output is a fake Donald Trump video or whatever.
Yeah, democratized access to fakery, basically, is what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's like the big change.
Right. Yeah, so what we want to talk about now is like, what does that mean, right, for society? What are the impacts? Or, I mean, I think a lot of people's first instinct would be to be alarmed, right? It sounds somewhat disturbing.
Well, there are at least some alarming elements of this, right? I think it's important to point out that faking things that aren't audio and video has also been possible for a long time, right? So like, there's plenty of fake. Perhaps you've heard of fake news, right? This is a thing.
Yes.
There's plenty of fake text in the world. Fake news is maybe just one small sliver of the fake text that is out there, because text inherently, since it's a symbolic system, is pretty easy to fake. If I wanted to write something and sign your name to it, I could probably pretty easily impersonate you in text, much more easily than with audio or video.
Yeah, like a good writer or can just pretty much gather someone's style by reading their work and imitate it pretty thoroughly and convincingly, right? And that's been possible for as long as writing has existed.
Exactly. And it has caused problems before, right? I mean, people have received a letter that was fake and made political decisions and romantic decisions and other big decisions based on that. So it is something that, there's stories about it going back years, Cyrano, or, there's a million of them. And to some extent, this is just that. This is just the general problem of fakery creeping up into another part of our life. But I do feel that people are inherently more skeptical of text than they are of, for example, video, which has not been easily fakeable in our lives.
Well, what's interesting about text is pretty much as soon as we had the technology of writing, we had the technology of faking writing. Like those things arrived together. So,
right.
Immediately you were trained on the fact that would be a possibility. So, but yeah, when you get to a more complex medium, I think photography is an interesting one maybe to talk about next.
Okay.
When you have the onset of photography, it's not the same as when you have writing, and it can also be faked. It's like for a while we have photography, and now I think you can certainly fake almost any type of photograph. But in the early days of photography, it would have been not a trivial process to fake a photograph. I suppose you could paint something. I guess in the early days of photography, when photographs were somewhat poor quality, maybe a good painter could make a pretty good imitation, right? But it's difficult enough that I think, in the early days of photography, you could feel like photographic evidence actually meant something, right? Like
right,
that this carries some weight as maybe possibly forged, but highly unlikely to be forged. And so people are very likely to believe what they see a photograph of.
Right. Like in court evidence, for example, photographs were, very commonly accepted as evidence up until, when Photoshop became a commonly obtained program. And then I think people's skepticism had to grow about photographs that they see. And now there's a whole sort of subfield of forensic photography where people have an expertise in looking closely at pictures to see if they've been faked, to try to determine if Photoshop has been used to alter the photo, which there's still some evidence of if you look closely enough. But if you are just looking at it from the normal vantage point that you would look at a photo, it's often very difficult to determine a digitally edited photo from one that's just digitally stored.
Whereas, something that's video today doesn't really suffer from the same problem if you have security camera footage or something, because that still has a pretty high bar for being faked. We're still likely to accept that as true.
Right. The way we think of faking video now is like staging a video, not taking a existing video stream and digitally altering it to your specs. So, you might be skeptical if the entire thing appears stageable, but you're not going to be skeptical just of the image itself.
Yeah. So obviously, society's skepticism changes in response to what they know is technologically possible. And I think, to some extent, there's even an analogy to things like advertising, which we've talked about, right? I think people have had increased skepticism towards certain types of marketing. Of course, that's always a moving target. But, society evolves. And I think that's one of the first things that we're going to have to expect will happen, right? Once it's possible to completely fake video and audio, people's skepticism is going to go through the roof. Now, there might be a delay there, I think, and that's somewhat concerning, right? Because general public's not always completely aware of what's technologically possible the day it becomes possible. But I've got to assume that's going to filter out pretty quickly.
Right.
Well, and interestingly, if you go to the ethics page of the Lyrebird website, they talk about their explicit goal as being sort of promoting awareness via their technology, right? They want to make it freely available and publicize it and be super open about it so that, maybe everybody realizes this exists rather than this being, say, developed privately by someone who's going to try to misuse it immediately.
Yeah, I found their ethics statement kind of funny because it didn't identify any real responsibilities they felt they had, but it did say that they hoped that their technology and their promotion of it would convince courts around the world to just take audio evidence far less seriously, because it's a proof of concept that audio evidence can be faked. Which is, I think, not everybody would feel that was adequately addressing their ethical requirements. But I thought it was a very funny and sort of engineering type approach.
Yeah, it's sort of like saying, this is going to happen anyways, so we'd better do it free and, open, right? Yeah,
and like our main important point is, if we can do this, other people can do this, so you better assume people are doing it, basically, which is, I'm sympathetic to that point of view. I think that's the right way to handle a new transformative technology, is to embrace it and to try to accept as quickly as possible that it's going to get out in the world and its implications are, need to be dealt with.
Yeah. So, and I think that will get out. Like, I mean, barring some weird transition moment where people get blindsided by something they didn't know was possible. I mean, that could maybe happen once, but I think, like, by and large, we're expecting a future where skepticism goes up. And it's interesting to wonder about whether that hits anything like a healthy balance, right? Because if, it's possible to have, too much skepticism to the point that you have, total distrust of everything. And I think that is, part of the conversation today now around fake news sort of revolves around that potential danger where on the one hand, you want to be skeptical, but on the other hand, if you have, total skepticism to where you don't do any work to follow up and attempt to at least parse out what's true and isn't true, then it's possible to kind of give up, right? And throw up your hands and write off everything. And that, I don't know if that's a problem. That certainly doesn't sound good, right? It sounds like you want, a public that's somewhere in the middle, right? That's literate about what's possible and has some tools for trying to discern which things might be real or might not be, without completely just writing off everything they see. Yeah,
well, the danger there is that people just believe what they want to believe. It's not that they assume everything's fake, which I think is possibly, a little hopeless, but could be potentially a useful pose. But it's that they assume everything's fake they don't agree with, because this combines with everybody's existing sort of my side biases and confirmation bias. And so, then that's the real danger to me, is that you believe the fake stuff that confirms your point of view, but you don't believe the fake stuff that challenges it. That could lead to people's ideas just getting more and more calcified and polarized. Not sure that that's the way it goes necessarily. And I think a healthy skepticism of where our messages are coming from and who is sending them to us is a good thing, not a bad thing. But it can go too far. It can get to the point where you won't listen to anything that challenges your worldview, basically.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up biases, because I think that I think the first reaction to this is, oh my gosh, this is going to be, like, if we think it's bad now, this is going to be like a horrible situation in the future where you just can't tell what's true and what isn't. But I think actually the impact of those inherent biases might be a lot stronger than any particular technology anyways. So I feel like even with today's technology, people's biases allow them to believe stuff, I think, in a somewhat irrational way, or in a way that plays into whatever their slant is. And like, that problem already exists, and that problem's not necessarily going away. And just having better technology, may not actually move the needle as much when you have that, that human bias at the foundation sort of dictating what people do and don't believe.
Yeah. I could only see it making it worse in the sense that it plays into that very bias. But I don't think it's... Yeah, I mean, we're already dealing with that now, as I think is pretty clearly seen, where people just ignore, all kinds of evidence that doesn't confirm what they already believe. Another thing that might happen if this gets to be widespread and well known, though, is, when we talked about various things that retain value in the future as things get ephemeralized, one thing we talk about is authenticity, right? The true nature or true origin of artifacts and things. And if stuff can be reliably synthesized, let's blow this a little bit further into the future. If I can type a few commands into a computer and it can generate for me a Wes Anderson movie or something, then we might see that authenticity being devalued in the future by technology like this.
Right. So an easy analogy from the past is probably just, forged paintings, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Like a painting gets its value from authenticity. And I think we first discussed this many, many, many episodes ago. Early on, we did a podcast on, things that remain scarce in the future. And one of them is supposed to be authenticity. At least I think we had that on our list. Because even in a world where you can perfectly forge things, there still technically is an original. But of course, if you can't spot the original, like if it's actually not even possible to distinguish. And I think this is like a sort of a moment where our thought experiment forks a little bit, right? Because we're assuming that you can fake audio and video, but there's a question about like how much with research can you maybe uncover ultimately, whether or not it's fake or not, right?
Because right. There's a difference between a fakery that convinces you on first watch, and a fakery that fools forensics, right? Because one thing that has been happening, like I mentioned with the Photoshop thing, is that forensics has actually been getting better, riding the same wave of information technology that fakery is riding. So people are able to use computer analysis now to, look at the pixels of a photoshopped JPEG and determine, this edge here, comes from an edit. This tiny amount of, wrong colored pixels here that the human eye couldn't ever pick out indicates where an edit was made.
Right.
And so at the same time as we're getting an easier fakery that convinces humans, it's actually getting harder and harder to convince computers of the truth of these things. So it may be that this is just like an arms race where forensics wins and authenticity is still determinable. And, in the case of things like evidence in court, you can run a program that will tell you if this is a real audio file or not. And that does change the social implications, because then you're just talking about fooling people who want to be fooled, basically fooling people who are, are fake news consumer type people who are, their biases are pushing them in one direction. And then it's easier to sort of lie to your own followers with this technology. But if somebody is truly skeptical and really wants to check it out, they can go to isthisfake.com or whatever and run the program, and it can tell them, oh yeah, that's fake. It's created by this program that came out 6 months ago or whatever, right?
Right.
So yeah, I mean, that's a different world. I don't know which of those worlds we end up in. I guess it's a fair guess. I think it could be either way.
Yeah, and I think it's the same for the art example too, right? In terms of the value of authenticity that you brought up, which is that if we're in the world where some kind of forensics actually works, then you have the same kinds of people that do that today that can verify that a work of art is in fact the original, done by the original creator. And so that would retain its value because, if it's, probably there would be places on the web that you could confirm the authenticity of something.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think a world where like there are workable forensics is actually really not very different from today. Yeah. I think we can almost like kind of just box that outcome and say that maybe even though it feels really different that all of a sudden the internet is full of all these like incredible fakes, If you can, again, always go to isthisfake.com or whatever that
Right.
the future version of that is,
Right.
it's still just a world where people who try to find the truth in most cases can get a pretty good idea. And it's good to have that kind of healthy skeptical stance, that's sort of in the middle where you distrust at a first glance, but then do some research if you need to find out. But many, many people don't bother, right? And so you have a large crowds of people that can be manipulated because it's just a little too much work to type "is this fake" into your web browser. So then that I think raises a bunch of interesting questions that we already are faced with today, which is that maybe sort of the platforms where people consume fake media need to take some responsibility and make getting that isthisfake.com information more frictionless and easier, right? That seems like the potential solution in today's world, and the potential solution in a world that we're talking about that's just a little bit more extreme in this direction is if the platforms that people are using, let's say it's Facebook or Google or whatever it is, editorialize a little bit, and or privilege stuff that has some sort of expertise or third party confirming it is true, or at least noticeably flag the stuff that's untrue, then maybe that helps solve the problem for people that otherwise wouldn't put the effort in. But then you have a bunch of problems there too, which is that now you have these platforms with a tremendous amount of power essentially saying what is and isn't true. Although that's, arguably they already have that power. This would just be
just today. Yeah.
Yeah. This would just be maybe a more responsible way for them to wield their power if they wanted to. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that offhand?
No, that sounds right to me. I feel like, if there are centralized platforms, then they are in a unique position to just, run forensic analysis on everything that goes through and give it a little truth score or something like that. I think people who want to be deceived are going to be deceived just like we have now. But there is some middle ground too, where if it's not for evidence in court or some other official purpose, if you're not trying to get a passport or that sort of thing, then there's just generally going to be less scrutiny put on things. And so I think you'll have the easiest time faking something on social media or on other sort of many-to-many small-scale distribution strategies, because there it's going to be kind of in no one's interest to bother checking.
Right. It becomes a low priority in many, many just casual news consuming situations.
Or even just personal situations, on a dating site. Imagine that I wanted to make a dating profile and I just wanted all of my videos and pictures to look more attractive. I could run this software, I suppose, and it could synthesize a version of me that's taller and thinner and has a stronger jawline or whatever it is that, I think would matter. I feel like there's a lot of just sort of casual uses of, if I imagine this being available in an app like the way that Snapchat bunny ears are, then I just feel like there's a lot of casual fakery that could just be kind of happening all the time that maybe isn't societally dangerous in the way that faking an announcement of nuclear war by the president would be, and then somehow getting that on television, right?
Right.
I could understand, obviously that's more existentially dangerous, but I also feel like that will be subjected to much more scrutiny than just the advertisement I make for my local business, or, the personal ad I put for dates, or the post that I put up for my friends to see on Facebook. So the kind of casual denigration of the truth that could potentially take place with this technology is a little bit concerning to me, and possibly culture corrects for this. Possibly people, call you a poser if you, or the equivalent future word, if you do that sort of thing. And so social norms, clamp down on it. But if they don't, then, you could imagine a world where just a lot more of the information you're getting about the world around you is not exactly true.
Well, a lot more of the information that you'd get online would be, it already, I think, has, and you've discussed this before, this sort of performative, curated quality to it, right? Yes. Because it's all, things get somewhat abstracted when they go online and they become bits that you can manipulate. And I mean, already people kind of pose with the type of text they put up and the type of photos they just select, right?
Sure,
and I think this,
and what have you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I think this intensifies, people's ability to sort of shape their persona in all situations. I think, it doesn't eliminate, in-person type situations. At least like part of our thought experiment, I think, is that we're mostly assuming this is something that is happening in audio and video. I mean, it's a different world, I suppose, if you can actually, fake a mannequin of yourself in the real world. But let's set that crazy thought aside.
Well, that seems possible. It seems like it would require the permission of the person being fooled.
Yeah.
Because I think like AR glasses or, cinematic reality glasses or whatever that come out in the future might be able to, overlay a real-time generated Barack Obama on top of me or something. But I don't think they could do that without you, the viewer, allowing it. I think that seems to me like you would require the permission of the person being fooled, which at that point it's a consensual, make-believe activity. It's more like putting on a show for someone. It's not I'm not worried about the truth at that point.
It could be a hack, I suppose, but that just, if there's a big security flaw or something, maybe it could be pulled off that way too. But I think I don't want to get too much into that because I think that's an even more extreme version that's interesting.
Right.
But I think, like for example, in your dating example, eventually, if you're going to go on a date, they're going to meet you in person. So, just like that strategy doesn't work necessarily that great today, where you can just put up your best photos. Putting up truly faked photos may not work. Now, I think in situations where there never will be an in-person interaction, like, perhaps like with a celebrity that you're engaging with, like you could fake a whole celebrity, right? Or if you never met that person in the physical world, and every encounter you had with them was this modified version of them that was taller and better looking and so on, you would never have any reason to ever find out that what you had seen all along wasn't the real person.
Right.
Although I don't know, again, the stakes are low in these situations, right? And I think, if we're just talking about an entertainer or something, maybe that's okay, right?
Well, I don't think it's a problem, but I think it could be interesting for the entertainer because they could choose to maintain their anonymity when not performing by embodying some faked persona. So, let's say this is like a YouTube influencer type personality, somebody who does YouTube videos, and they've got technology that's something like a super version of those two demos we discussed. So they can speak and move in real time. A puppet will be generated that, looks different from them in some way and sounds different from them in some way. They could generate their videos like that, and then when they go out to the grocery store to buy groceries, they don't have to worry about, crazy fans wanting to take pictures with them because nobody would know what they really look like. They would just know what the persona looks like. And that's actually potentially valuable to somebody who wants some of the positive trappings of celebrity without the negative parts.
Yeah. Well, and this is another distinction that's coming up too, right? Which is the difference between, say, spoofing a real person and just creating a new person whole cloth, right?
Right. Or editing yourself for someone else to look different.
Right. Which is sort of like essentially a new person.
Right.
And I think, I think the ethical implications seem stronger for when you're actually spoofing somebody. and essentially stealing their persona and making them do things that they wouldn't otherwise do.
Oh God, are people going to have intellectual property? I guess people already have likeness rights, right? So that already is an intellectual property protection for people's likenesses. Like if I do a George Clooney puppet and I become, George Clooney's YouTube channel about futurism, right? Can George Clooney sue me? Like, I'll assume that I'm really pretending to be him. I'm not saying I just look like George Clooney. I'm saying like, hi, I'm George Clooney and welcome to Review the Future or whatever. And it looks like him. It sounds like him. Then he's got a case against me, right? I'm pretty sure he can take me to court for that.
I think I'm not obviously a legal expert at all, but my understanding is that, with current laws, if you're actually attempting to convince people that you are in fact George Clooney and it's not a parody or something, I think that you could be taken to court over something like that. And actually, something similar to this question was brought up by one of our listeners. I put a brief question on Twitter about this topic to see who would answer. So someone named Joe Levy wanted us to talk about the idea that labels could release music on a musician's behalf, and of course that would be very similar to a production company releasing a movie on an actor's behalf, or any time you take someone's likeness, whether it's their audio likeness or their visual likeness, and produce something with it. I mean, the example you were talking about is very funny. It sounds like sort of like a rogue person just like sets up a fake Clooney channel. But I think you could also think of and this is the plot of a movie, The Congress, right, where an actress signs over her likeness rights to a company, which then can make endless movies starring her. Without her permission or control, or without her even being needed to be there, and I think that's definitely an interesting place,
right? And I think we're approaching that already with modern filmmaking technology, right? I think if I remember correctly, I think Carrie Fisher's parts in I think 2 Star Wars ago, there were parts of Carrie Fisher that were digitally generated. I mean, with her permission and stuff. They didn't. It wasn't a dystopian situation, I don't think. But I think she was, not able to do the performance, and they used some computers to fake her in at least a couple of shots. So that is something that we're able to do to some extent now, with limitations. But you can. I know. Zemeckis for years has been trying to digitize actors because he hates them and he doesn't want to work with them, right? He has this whole his idea of a movie cast is just Tom Hanks and a beach ball, but he wants to just have all the actors scanned completely into the computer so he can input a script and start moving cameras around, and it does seem like that's the extremely long trajectory of movie making, if that continues to be something society wants to do.
Don't sign a bad contract, basically. I think is because I think that if you have likeness rights, which in this space, which I think you certainly will, and it seems like that's the precedent, Zemeckis would have to have the rights to do that, and I think just be careful signing over your persona in perpetuity.
Yeah, but just make sure that you have some kind of residuals coming in if they use you.
So let's talk about some higher stakes stuff for a moment, right? This may be a situation where a murder may have or have not been committed, and there's some sort of possibly faked evidence involved, right? Another situation that is brought up is the idea of misleading a diplomat. With say like a fake audio or video call, which could of course, possibly lead to war in the worst case scenario. Then there's, things like fraud and ID theft, which could be very, very bad, life ruining for individuals, right? So you have these much higher stake situations. Higher stakes, I mean, in the sense of not that the fake news stuff isn't also high stakes, because propaganda and manipulation is a big deal for sure. But higher stakes in the sense of there's a lot more incentive for parties involved to invest in the forensics if they're available, right? If you get a call that could start a war, or if you see a video that says that you're guilty of murder, or if your ID is stolen, there is a lot of reason to use the best possible forensic technology to try to solve that problem, right? And discover the actual truth of what's going on. But I think if we now take the darker thought experiment and imagine that forensics is not keeping up, right?
Right, which is entirely possible.
Yeah, then I think that is where we have a weirder world with quite a bit of uncertainty. And it's interesting, I think, to talk then about what strategies you could use that aren't of the sort that we mentioned earlier, like forensic, looking at, the pattern of pixels and determining, that this is clearly like a signature of this well-known algorithm, so we know that this is a fake photograph, right? I think there are other ways maybe to sort of verify recordings at the time they're occurring, that could be solutions, right? To sort of create, more robust standards of truth, right? In the recordings that we create. Yeah.
Well, the easiest thing to lean on, in my opinion, is just multiple sources, right? Because the way that these fakeries work is that they're being done in a stream that you have access to. So unless a hacker has managed to hack every security camera that could possibly have picked up the murder, say, to use that example, then showing one camera where the murderer is not in the frame and the victim kills themselves, and then 5 other videos from further away that show 2 blurry figures getting into an altercation, you would assume that the one with the seppuku has been faked.
Yeah. And so if the future is one that we've posited before, where there's just large quantities of ambient surveillance happening all the time, everywhere, right, at least in public spaces, I think it does solve the problem in the way that you're describing, at least insofar as it's a public arena right now.
Right. And the more owners or controllers of those surveillance streams that there are, the more robust the system is, because if it's got a single point of failure, you could hack all the streams. But if, let's say, each building has its own security camera and that's controlled only by that building's security system, the chance that we hacked every separate building is much lower than, the chance that we hacked one.
Yeah. Becomes like a majority vote among the recording devices, essentially, right? Like, what does the majority of devices say? And if this isn't, a totally locked down police state situation, I think we can assume that they weren't all faked.
Right.
Now, I think that is a really promising direction. Again, but that only sort of works in, I think, a public sphere where there's likely to be a lot of recording devices. In a private sphere where one person controls the space, there may only be one source, if any.
Right.
I guess there has to be at least one for it to be faked. So another thing that I thought about is just starting to build authentication methods directly into cameras and microphones, right? And I think there's sort of a distributed way to do this, or like a decentralized way to do this, and a centralized way to do this, right? The centralized way is, every time I take a picture with my phone, that is run through some sort of third-party authentication, right? Like, in other words, I'm using a platform to take my pictures, take my video, take my recorded audio. That is a trusted third party that part of their reputation and part of what they do is they ensure that everything that is taken or recorded with their platform happened at a specific time and has not been tampered with, right? So if you had a big enough company or a third party that people could invest enough trust in, then if you ran your recordings through that, so like, it goes to a server or something, then you might be able to create trusted recordings that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So Facebook or somebody could do this. It could also, even if it allows fakery, it could just mark the fakery and still work just as well. But yeah, if there's some trusted party that puts a marker down that says, this is guaranteed authentic by the Facebook authentication system. We have you're running a phone that's a trusted system. It's reporting to us whether it's giving you the image right off the camera or not, and we can stamp that. I can imagine ways you might defeat that, but it seems like as an arms race sort of philosophy that could definitely work.
And this seems really to be very, very likely to me, because I think, conspiracy theories aside, I think if you have a big enough institution, while they might tamper with certain things in certain special cases, I think for just like casual everyday use, if their reputation is staked on it, I think a lot of people would probably be able to trust this stuff. And what this would lead to is essentially anything that wasn't any like recording that wasn't taken or passed through this trusted system, you would essentially disregard almost like out of hand. Right.
Right. You would just assume that it could be fake, and therefore you wouldn't trust it the same way. Yeah. And you wouldn't even necessarily need a third party to implement this, right? You could implement this using another technology for distributed trust. You could use like a blockchain technology.
Yes, that's the decentralized version. And obviously, I think many people would be fans of this if they're concerned about some sort of centralized tampering occurring,
or if they just don't want to give that much power to Facebook or Google or somebody. I mean, already we use those powerful systems to verify identity on in terms of like logins and such like that. So things that are easier to fake and therefore people are more skeptical of. But it seems that, not everybody wants to give Facebook that control, and I can understand why. So I imagine the most likely world is a world where both large companies and some kind of distributed network are engaged in providing trust in this, in this arena.
And you might have multiple parties that do that. So, for example, going back to the really high stakes situation, the sort of like diplomat conversation where you want to ensure that things are correct, you probably want to rely on several forms of authentication, right? Because, one single, authenticator could be potentially faked, and there might be like reason enough to try to like even, manipulate one authenticator in such like a big situation as that, right? But if you had the ability to say run a recording through multiple third parties, with different interests and, like different power bases, then you might be able to get a relatively high certainty about things that are truly important. At least as good as anything ever is today anyways, right?
Right. And I don't think, the important thing to recognize is that you don't need perfect trust. You just need enough trust that any madman with a webcam can't just start a nuclear war.
Exactly.
I mean, these are high stakes situations, but in a way it's a little bit of a low bar to cross, because a lot of the day-to-day, work of a diplomat, it could be faked and it could fool them and it could take them 3 days to figure it out, and nothing bad will happen. There's only a small subset of diplomatic questions on which that kind of failure is not acceptable. Mm-hmm. So it's only those that would need the kind of, and I think already, I'm not an expert on this, but I think that diplomatic circles have their own internal authentication schemes in place. And I think they also use various third-party schemes. So I think there'd probably be some combination of homegrown and third-party approaches to try to weed out fakeries as they come in.
Yeah. Perhaps the simplest solution in a way here is, of course, just to do maybe more business in person, right? And I think you could make an argument that in this world, there is some increased emphasis on that in some situations. I think that's already the case, right? Because I think just eavesdropping is already such a big issue, particularly in diplomacy, that electronic communication is somewhat devalued. I mean, of course, we know that diplomats use a lot of email, but maybe in the last couple of years, they've learned that wasn't such a great idea due to the multitude of email-related scandals and hacks and leaks that have happened across the world and certainly in the United States recently. So
Yeah, I think that there is a great value if you are concerned with both secrecy and authenticity, as diplomats are, in doing things in person. But it's also not always practical. So you have to have some strategy for what are you going to do when, your counterpart's in Russia and you guys need to talk now, or something like that.
Yeah. So just to kind of sum up, I think, I feel like in many ways, this isn't a hugely, it seems like a really big deal when you first start talking about this, but it seems to me now, after talking through it, I would be willing to bet that in a lot of cases, this isn't that different from the world we're already in. Again, in the truly high stakes situations, I think there will be technological solutions, and whether that's forensics or third-party authentication or decentralized authentication, I think there'll be options available. And the sort of more just general casual fakery that happens. I think we already live in a world where people believe stuff that's untrue all the time due to their own, either biases or, reluctance or inability to just spend the time researching what they're looking at. And so I think that's obviously a tremendous problem we have today, but I don't see that necessarily getting that much worse. It just seems like that just continues. I think perhaps the one thing that I would be scared of that does seem maybe genuinely different in this future is, again, going back to the real-time nature of it, is the sort of on the fly, I get a phone call that sounds like somebody I know. Because it's happening in real time, I don't have, maybe an easy way to verify it.
Right. It's Nigerian Prince scams are the thing that I'm most worried about in this world, because already people fall for those when objectively they shouldn't, right? And they're just going to get more convincing with this. This is going to allow people to do a much more convincing scam over the phone, over Skype, over whatever, medium, social media, whatever that people are using. And, that is already a fight in our world. So this isn't a huge sea change, but I do think that will be harder to combat once this stuff becomes fully available. I also think there'll be a benefit to it of, a lot more and better political comedy. Because if you guys haven't yet clicked, you got to watch the George W. Bush face on the face-to-face demo. It is, the guy is just trying out the tech. He's just sort of making funny faces, and then you see George W. Bush making those same faces, and even that little amount of concept is very amusing. So I imagine that comedians and the like will have a field day with this stuff.
Yeah, and it's sort of maybe an oversight that we haven't talked enough about just how fun actually this can be. That's a big part of this future that one aspect that we can at least look forward to, I think.
So I think we've covered the basic elements of what this technology will do. It'll call into question, I think, a lot of things that we currently use as evidence, but ultimately I think it will lead us to a more skeptical and more entertaining future. Until next time. I'm Ted Cupper. I'm John Perry. And you've been listening to Review the Future.
To subscribe or leave a comment on this episode, please visit reviewthefuture.com. You can also send emails to feedback@reviewthefuture.com. Thanks for listening.